Good morning. Good morning. Are we on? I told the Reverend Ganung that I would like to give a morning meeting talk on Iran to go with our reading of Persepolis. And he said I could go in January or February when things opened up. Then a few days ago, he asked me to step in for today. And it was only then that I realized the reason I don't like giving pop quizzes as a teacher is how much I didn't like them as a student. So welcome to a pop school meeting. It's also really intimidating to follow such a great school meeting on Tuesday, but for better or worse, I won't be singing. And for better or worse, you have been denied the magic of PowerPoint. I found Persepolis to be a compelling story, compelling enough that I read Persepolis 2. It helps that you can read them in a summer afternoon and still have time for a nap. In Persepolis 2, Marjane Satrapi finds herself in even more extreme circumstances. At one point, she's homeless on the streets of Austria. And when she returns home to Iran, she is profoundly aware of how hard it is to fit in. In many ways, Persepolis is the story of a young woman who no longer has a home. She's no longer Iranian and never completely can be European. Her country has moved away from her as she has moved away from it. She is left with a profound sense of alienation. The black and white illustrations only reinforce the stark feeling of isolation she has. What does it mean to be an Iranian? I went to a conference a few years ago about Iran and met some Iranian expatriates. They too feel this aching sense of loss, like an amputation, over the fact that their country left them even as they left it. Iran's history is as long as history itself. In fact, the first histories were the wars between the Greeks and the Persians. Throughout antiquity, whether it was Greeks or Macedonians or Romans, Europeans looked eastwards towards a powerful Persian empire. Greek independence was affirmed by fighting the Persians. Alexander's greatness was in conquering them. Rome's limits were defined in the east by them. In more recent times, Iran has seen itself shrink in relative importance. But unlike most everywhere else in the globe, Iran was never fully colonized by European powers. However, the British and Russians did jockey for power internally, with Britain more or less coming out on top of what was called the Great Game in Iran. And Iranians truly and deeply hate the British to this day for the ways in which Britain violated Iranian sovereignty. Iranians can look into their past and see true greatness, which makes their current state of affairs all the more painful. For much of modern Iran's history, the U.S. was considered a friend and protector. Hey, Amber, how's it going? Morning. It was only when the U.S. helped Britain overthrow the government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, mostly to help the British Petroleum Company, that we became a symbol of their fall from international greatness. We helped overthrow Mossadegh because he was getting too cozy with the Marxist Tudeh Party, which was too cozy with Moscow. This was a Cold War move that continues to reverberate to this day. After the coup, Shah Reza Pahlavi ruled over a brutal police state for almost a quarter of a century. He was America's best friend in the Middle East after Israel. In fact, Iran and Israel had excellent relationships under the Shah, and the reason has to do with Iran's unique status in the world. While Iran is a Middle Eastern country, Iran is not an Arab country. The majority of Iranians are Persians, though there are significant populations of Azeri, Kurds, Baluchis, and Arabs. Iran is also a Shiite country, whereas most of the Muslim world is Sunni. Therefore, they stood apart from the Arab world's conflict with Israel, or at least they did until the '78 revolution. In the late 70s, President Jimmy Carter urged the Shah to ease some of the brutality of his rule, but at that point, easing the brutality only breathed life into the opposition. Within a year, the Shah had fled the country, a despised man in failing health. That's the historical moment that Persepolis begins with. And for most Americans, it is the moment that Iran appears on their horizon. The ouster of the Shah did not necessarily mean that Iran would become a revolutionary Islamic republic. Instead, what happened was a coup d'etat inside a revolution. Young Marjane was marching in the streets to oust the Shah, but she was as equally as opposed to the government that eventually came to power in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini was a renowned Islamic scholar, a gifted politician, and a glowering, frightening presence on the evening news when I was a boy. After Iranian student militants seized the U.S. Embassy and took the Americans there hostage, Khomeini became the living, breathing embodiment of Islam to many Americans. And Islam itself became a faith defined for many Americans by flag burning, angry shouting, and the ominous, heavy-browed face of Khomeini. But the truth of the matter is more complicated. Khomeini's vision of Islam is, of course, a Shiite vision, and most Muslims are Sunni. And what's more, Khomeini's vision of Shiism is refuted by many Shiite scholars. Most Shiite scholars have preferred what they call a quietist version of Shia that stands aside from the affairs of governments, whereas Khomeini placed all important governing powers in the hands of religious figures, most obviously himself. The 1978 overthrow of the Shah was not destined to become the establishment of an Islamic Republic. That event was shocking to many Iranians, and I think that comes across strongly in Satrapi's graphic novel. Even after the hostages came home, and even after Khomeini died, Iran always stood in stark defiance to the United States. In the 80s, we shot down an Iranian airliner full of civilians. They funded terrorist attacks on Westerners. We gave Saddam Hussein weapons to fight the Iranians. They attacked U.S. naval vessels in the Persian Gulf. From my childhood, watching the Iranian hostage crisis unfold on my TV every night after dinner, Iran has always been starkly the other. As the Cold War ended in the shuddering, peaceful collapse of a failed ideology, Iran continued to stand defiantly apart. In 1996, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard helped blow up an American barracks in Khobar, Saudi Arabia. But 2 years later, al-Qaeda detonated bombs outside the U.S. Embassy in Tanzania and Kenya. 2 years after that, they attacked the USS Cole in Yemen. 1 year after that was 9/11. There was a striking image I remember from those awful days after 9/11. It was of a peaceful candlelit march in honor of the victims. There were many such marches and marchers in that week after the Trade Center collapsed. Tearful faces lit by candles from country to country around the globe. What was striking about these marchers was that they were Iranian, and the march was in Tehran. For a few months, as America and NATO struck back at al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan, the Iranian government secretly and quietly helped us. The Taliban, a radical vision of Sunni Islam, was their enemy too. And al-Qaeda saw Shiites like the Iranians as apostates, worse than infidels. And then President Bush gave a speech where he identified a new axis of evil in the world. He identified its members as Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Now, first of all, these were, and in 2 cases are, awful regimes, brutal, repressive, authoritarian. But they also had nothing to do with 9/11. By March 2003, we were invading Iraq. In Washington, D.C., neoconservatives were saying, everyone wants to go to Baghdad, real men want to go to Tehran. Plans were made that after the expected quick victory in Iraq, U.S. forces would be free to pivot eastward and effect regime change in Tehran, as the Iranians were to be caught between U.S. forces on its western border in Iraq and its eastern border in Afghanistan. As late as 2008, John McCain was singing a reworked version of the Beach Boys song, rendering it "Bomb, bomb, 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 Iran." Needless to say, there was no more cooperation between Washington and Tehran after that, quiet or otherwise. At this moment, ISIS is considered the gravest threat to world civilization, even though they're confined to a relatively small area, have no global reach, and are repellent to most of the Muslim world. But just a few years ago, it was Iran. And if we should somehow vanquish ISIS, I'm sure Iran will find itself right back at the top of the list of gravest threats to world civilization. For 40 years now, Iran has been the implacable, inscrutable, indelible other. There was a public service ad campaign I remember as a kid that said, "You aren't born a racist." But I'm not entirely sure about that. I think human beings evolved to be wary of others. We evolved in small groups bound by kinship. As those groups grew larger, it became important to differentiate between those like us and them. There was safety in us, danger in them. I actually think it requires an act of education to move beyond seeing the world in stark terms of us and them. It's not an act of education that is accomplished in a single seminar or the yearly observation of Martin Luther King Day or a single school meeting. We are born, I believe, very wary of those different than us. Now, if we live in New York City, we're surrounded by people who are different than us, so many of them, that we aren't really sure who they are. Red Sox fans, probably. If you're an African American and your neighbors are Irish, the lines of us and them get blurry. But only if you have the neighbors over every once in a while. Only if you leave the door open. It requires that act of educating yourself to move beyond us and them. I was in college in the 80s when diversity first became a buzzword. My college campus was as white as the New Hampshire snow, but we were encouraged to value diversity. And though my fraternity and rugby team had a few African American and Native American members, the fact was that diversity didn't mean much in a community that was so overwhelmingly white. I could nod along and say, yeah, diversity, right. But I look back at the kid that I was and I shake my head. I had no idea what I was talking about. Diversity isn't a buzzword. It isn't a seminar. It isn't an end state. We don't arrive at diversity. We struggle with it. We come to terms with some aspect of diversity and then discover a massive blind spot. We find old ways of thinking popping unbidden into our heads. We look around and see them. If we are in fact born racist, or at least born with a deep-seated prejudice against those we don't identify with, then we are engaged in a constant struggle to change. Because the old, ingrained way of thinking of us and them is at the root of war and poverty and crime and oppression. Tribal thinking may have made sense when the world was sparsely populated by bands of hunter-gatherers, but in an interconnected, crowded world, it is folly and madness. It is the logic of the lynchman's rope, the concentration camp, and the ISIS video. Why should I care about a girl growing up in Iran in the 70s and 80s? Why should I care about Iran at all? I have come to believe that empathy may be the single greatest expression of wisdom. Empathy is the ability to see things from someone else's perspective, to feel what they feel. It is very hard. And it is hardest of all when the person you have to empathize with is different from you and even antagonistic towards you. And yet, that is when it is most critical. We are told that Iran is a threat to us because they are building a nuclear capability that could include weapons, and that is troubling. But we've already overthrown one Iranian government in living memory, and we were talking about invading Iran as part of the Axis evil within the last decade. Certainly, Iran's behavior is paranoid, but that doesn't mean people, including the U.S., aren't out to get them. Seen from the perspective of Tehran, what they need most is a way to preserve their own safety. In 2009, millions of Iranians took to the streets to protest a stolen election. It was a remarkable moment, in many ways a precursor to the Arab Spring. And like much of the Arab Spring, it has been overwhelmed and extinguished. But the aspirations of those Iranians who wanted their votes counted, are they really so different from our aspirations? We read because we wish to learn. We learn because we wish to be wise. And we wish to be wise because that is where peace and happiness lie. You're not here to get better SAT scores. I mean, yeah, you kind of are. And we're trying to get you into a good college for you. But you're here to learn. And that means opening a book. Yes, even one that you're required to read. And then opening up your mind. You are here to be made wise. You are here to discover empathy. Empathy for an alienated Persian girl. Empathy for star-crossed lovers. Empathy for a runaway slave who wrote a memoir that helped change the world. There will always be forces and voices in the world that will shout, beware of them. But beware of falling into that easy trap. If Americans and Iranians can return to what was once a friendship, it will not be because of some sweet moment of bumper sticker diversity, but rather because we have wrestled with the diverse world in which we live. And we have to come to understand that we can define us to include anyone we want to. Open your books, Open your minds so that your hearts and arms may open too. Thank you.